All right, we're at the top of the clock, so we're going to begin. I'd like to welcome everyone to today's virtual Lunch and Learn on Vulnerability Management, presented by Iceberg and RSA. My name is Glenn Gower. I'm with Iceberg, and I'll be your moderator today. Today, we're rethinking vulnerability management and talking about how to evolve from an IT-only discussion into an IT and business collaboration to drive better metrics, resourcing, and communication. And this is a theme we're hearing a lot lately. The last webinar we hosted back in January was on supplier risk, and our guest told us much the same thing. It's critical to ensure that the business owns the risk. I'm joined today by my colleague David White in Toronto. David is a senior GRC consultant with Iceberg and has a background in cybersecurity, most recently in the financial sector. David leads our cyber risk and management consulting programs here at Iceberg. Good afternoon, David.
Hi, Glenn.
David, before I hand things over to you, we know that cyber risk is top of mind for everyone, and once again, we've had a very strong response to this webinar, to this topic. What is it specifically about vulnerability management that might be resonating so strongly with IT security professionals?
Yeah, good question, Glenn. Vulnerability management programs haven't changed much in recent times. The demands and the pressures from our business change, but we really haven't changed much in our vulnerability management programs. The industry, I think, is looking for better ways to meet the demands from the business, and how do we evolve our programs, our vulnerability management programs, in line with the business. I think this is a great opportunity for us to start looking at data a little differently than we have in the past.
All right. Well, throughout the discussion today, for folks who are joining us on the phone who've logged in, I hope you don't mind, David, but we will have the opportunity to interrupt you to ask some questions. On your screen, you'll see a Q&A pod, so if you have any questions as we go through, we'll try to answer those as we go. And we are recording today's event, so at the end of the webinar, we'll share a landing page where you can download the deck, the video recording, and we'll have some other resources available as well. So David, I'll turn things over to you.
Great, thanks, Glenn. I want to say that I think it's a great idea that we ask questions throughout this session. We're going to cover a bunch of different topics, and you're really only going to get, make sure you get the most out of it. If we can make this interactive, that would be great. I want to make sure that we touch on the points that people are looking for. Iceberg works with a lot of companies. We've taken a lot of data in, and we've built this material. But definitely, if there's something you don't understand, or if there's a question you have, or you want me to drill in on a certain area, I ask you to please put those questions in, and we'll try and address them throughout the session. Our agenda today is on the screen. We're going to talk a little bit about the traditional vulnerability management programs. We're not going to spend too much time on it, but I think it's important that we talk about where we've been before we talk about where we're going. We're going to talk a little bit about what's good and bad in those programs, what's missing, and what we think we can do better. We're going to talk about why we believe maybe a risk-driven program is more suited and in line with what our business is looking for. And then how do we get there? How do we add that business context? Where do we start? And then we're going to jump into a demo. That demo will illustrate everything that we talk about today. We're going to talk about how we look at vulnerabilities historically. We're going to talk about how we add context, and we're actually going to visualize what the new data sets look like. And definitely, if there's questions through that process, please put your hand up, and we'll try and answer that as quickly as possible. So if I jump right into our traditional vulnerability programs, I think it's important that we first establish why the programs are in place. So I come from a security practitioner background, and as much as we get caught in our security tools, I think it's always a good practice to understand why it's in place. Vulnerability management programs were originally put in place to detect and remediate vulnerabilities or threats that could impact our business. What does this mean? It means that programs are in place to protect our business. I know this is a simple point, but I think it's an important point that we understand why vulnerability programs are there. Why do we get scanners? why do we probe our network, and why do we gather this data? The end result is we're trying to protect our business functions or our corporate assets. Now, if we look at the way the industry has traditionally done it, most vulnerability programs start with an investment in a vulnerability management scanner. They'll go out there and they'll get the Qualys or the Rapid7s or the Nessus of the world. They'll deploy it on our network. We're very strategic in where we deploy these so that we have full coverage. We're not going to go into that today, but we will, the idea behind how we deploy our scanners, whether we're doing authenticated scanning versus unauthenticated scanning, whether we're doing full port scanning versus a selective port scanning, is dependent on your business needs. Today's discussion, we don't touch on that, right? So we trust that there's a scanner in place, and that scanner is probing your network, and it has access to all the assets to be able to collect the data. Once we've done our scanning, what are traditionally, our scanners will deliver us a set of results. Those results could be anything from 10,000 entries long to 100,000 entries long, and of course, millions. Depending on the size of your infrastructure, this data could vary greatly. So once we have our data, an analyst has to go and look at it. So we've collected this data, it's in a scanner. It's tied to an asset in a way because it has IP address information, it probably has DNS information and some other networking information. So we're able to tie these vulnerabilities back to an asset. Some would also argue that you might be able to actually tie these back to a business need in some way. I think we all understand what our highest, most critical assets are in the company, and we make some logical references to them, and we say these vulnerabilities mean this. The problem is when we start talking about tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, and millions of vulnerabilities, it's very difficult for an analyst to look at it and differentiate between what's good, what's bad, how do I get on top of it, how do I go and ask for more resourcing, how do I get more technology to patch it, where do I go from here? And every month that we have these discussions, the industry just keeps releasing more and more and more vulnerabilities, and the problem gets bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. So what we've done historically is we've created reports. Our scanners go out, they collect data, and we bring in some reports because now we need to remediate this. We're going to analyze it, we're going to send it out for remediation, and we're going to fix the problem. On the screen, you're seeing a report that is very common in the industry. This report takes data out of a vulnerability scanner, carves it up in a couple different ways to try and illustrate a point. The one we're looking at here, there's a couple things that we could look at. There's things that jump out. There's red markers on this screen. Red for me typically means something's bad. I see green arrows that are pointing up. I would argue that green arrows going up are probably a good thing. We can see that vulnerabilities are broken down by network zones. So we have external, we have DMZ, we have internal. One would argue that we're trying to provide some sort of information that allows us to differentiate between what's important and what's not important. I want to call out on the very bottom left here, there's a PCI scan, exploitable, says 0. One would argue 0 is good. The other would argue red is bad. So these reports become very subjective. We start looking at them and say, what does the report say to me? So if I pass this on to a management team and to our leadership teams, does this say anything to them? We see that SOX and PCI are called out on here, and I think that's important, but do we know if it's good or bad? Do we know, does this mean we're compliant or not compliant? Are we in trouble? Do we need to fix something? How much do we have to fix? So what we run into is this report and the reports that we've been generating, very similar to this, end up coming back down to us with more questions than us providing answers to our leadership team. And then we start a fire drill of trying to break this data down into more manageable numbers to say what's next and where are we going to go from here. One thing to call out is this report, although very typical from what we see, is very IT-centric. In security, we break things down into DMZ, external and internal, exploitable, not exploitable. Those are all still very, very much IT-centric terms. When I pass this on to our business leaders and from some of the workshops that Iceberg has done in this area, we show them this data and we ask them, leadership team, what does this data mean to you? Why is this not meeting your needs, and where do we need to go to get better data? How do we go collect better data, analyze better data, formulate better results so that when it gets up to our leadership team, it's answering the questions that they're looking for? The messaging was fairly clear from the leadership team. They didn't understand the data. They're not suggesting the data is wrong. They're not suggesting the data is bad. What they're saying is we don't understand this data and what we're supposed to do with it. What does this mean to my business? Am I good? Am I bad? Do I need to make a decision? Do I need to invest somewhere? Do I need to have some top-down leadership activities happening somewhere? And if so, where do I go to do that? But those are all very fair questions, but none of that data can be pulled out of this report. So today's session, we're going to be talking about how do we bring business context into the vulnerabilities so that we help translate vulnerability data into business data that drives actionable results. There's some industry reports out there that show when a leadership team, a senior leadership team, an executive team, the board of directors are held accountable for breaches and vulnerability management, it drives a 43% reduction in the amount of vulnerabilities in that company. The similar report shows that 11% of those vulnerabilities are fixed quicker when executives are involved. What this shows us is we need help. IT needs help. The vulnerabilities are too big. We need to reach out to our executive team, our management teams, and ask for help. We need to be able to ask for it in a way that they understand it so that they can support us in turn. The bottom two numbers show how big the problem is. Right now it's taking over 100 days to remediate a vulnerability, and it's over 6,500 vulnerabilities are released every year. The problem is not going away. The problem is getting bigger. And the sooner we ask for help, the quicker we can start driving better remediation. So where do we start? We understand what technical data is. We understand that IT data doesn't provide us value to a business stakeholder. So this is data that we typically get out of a vulnerability scanner, right? So we'll get a scoring system from the industry, the CVSS scores. We'll probably get a remediation guide. We'll get an age, how long it's been out there on the market. We'll get dates on when it was first detected and so on and so forth. We're going to get some asset information because we had to actually scan an asset to find out if it was vulnerable or not. So this data you're seeing on the screen right now is very typical of what we would get out of our scanners. What we're suggesting is we need to add the next layer of business context to be able to aggregate vulnerability scores so that we can translate those into business vulnerability scores, not just asset vulnerability scores. We're going to talk about that. It's important that we link these vulnerabilities back to businesses. What is our business unit? What's our business structure? What's the products and services that are offered by those business units? And how do these vulnerabilities affect it? You can have business units, you can have departments that are critical to the infrastructure, critical to the business, and some that are more internal activities, not so critical. The same vulnerability applied to both those different business units shouldn't have the same risk rating back to the company. And that'll help us drive better remediation. It'll make the teams that have critical services more aware of critical vulnerabilities that are tied to their business units. Now, there's a lot of data on the screen. I get that, right? We don't have to have all this data to be able to aggregate scores. The more data we get, the better the scores get. It all starts with understanding what our business is doing. And this is where we originally talked about vulnerability programs are in place to secure our business. Traditional programs start with an IT asset, and we work our way to the business if we can get there. What we're suggesting is we need to back up and start with the business. Let's understand what our business products and services are doing, which ones are critical, which ones aren't critical. And I understand that a lot of companies struggle with that in itself. That doesn't have to be an exercise where we have to do fine granular tuning of all those processes. But we have to start somewhere. We have to start applying some sort of logic to our business products and services to understand what's important to us. If we don't understand which products and services are important to us, we don't know how to apply the appropriate controls to protect them. So, starting point for us is to collect the business processes and the business services that are important to the company. Once we understand what that is, we want to understand who owns it. Not just from the business, not just from, but from both business and IT. IT may have to fix them, but the business units are going to be responsible for them. It's important that they're both involved, and that could drive different remediation patterns. It's important to know what locations they are. Are they physical? Are they virtual? Are they in country? Are they out of country? These all could definitely impact if it's an important to fix or less important to fix. Does this increase the score or does this decrease the score? And then, of course, if we can understand things like all the applications and all the services on it, the more data we can gather, the more risk intelligence we can put into coming up with a score that drives better remediation. Right? We bring this back, and I can bring a vulnerability score to a business owner and say, here's your business, here are the 10 products that you support, and here are all the assets that support them, and this is your risk posture. It's a much different discussion than having an IT asset, an IP address, for example, with 100 vulnerabilities. It drives a better discussion. They're more aware. We're bringing information back to them at a business product and service level. And that's really what we're going for here. So how do we get there? Where do we start? Iceberg has proven methodology on conducting workshops to start gathering, collecting, and organizing data to be able to be aggregated, calculated, and reported back to the business and the leadership team. We work very closely with RSA Archer, GRC platform. This is a platform that allows us to gather everything from what you see on the screen there, business hierarchy, products and services, and everything else on there. It is important that we understand how the business functions, products and services. We want to know what IT assets support them. And the RSA Archer platform allows us to collect all that data through their multiple use cases and be able to aggregate risk scores and drive actionable results and dashboards out of it. Now, I want to point out, this is what you're seeing on the screen. This is what we put in place for vulnerability management. The Archer platform and Iceberg, we do a lot of other things around privacy and risk assessments. These are the things that would help drive a vulnerability management program. If there are things in your infrastructure that you say contribute to your vulnerability risk score, maybe it's a threat intelligence feed, maybe it's some other sources of data, maybe it's maybe it's an enterprise risk management program that feeds data in to help influence that score. These are all modules that we can bring in. These are all pluggable data sources that we can bring in, ties into the ecosystem within Archer, and allows us to drive at the same results. As I mentioned before, the more data we can bring in, the more ability we have to formulate better calculations to drive better results. All right. So at this point, I've sort of explained at a fairly high level what the concept is. And I don't think it's a very difficult concept. I think traditional programs start with vulnerabilities and try and tie themselves to assets, and we work our way back. We are suggesting a much different approach where we look at business structure and how do we bring that back and use vulnerability information to drive different results. So at this point, we have a demo where we've illustrated this. This is done in the Archer platform, and we'll walk you through that.
Hey, David.
Yes.
While you're switching over, we did have a question that came in while you were on the last slide. So while you're switching to the demo, I'll let you do that. The question is, how frequently, when you're working with clients, do they have all of that information? For example, the business hierarchy or the product and service information. Do organizations typically have all that data mapped already, or do you find that something where Iceberg is going in to assist with that? Like what level of maturity, I guess, do you typically work with when you're helping organizations to get started with this?
It's a very good question. And it's a good question because that's a common problem. And I'm going to back up before I go into the demo. I'm going to go back to the slide. And the reason why we work with RSA Archer's platform is, one, the data is usually not available. Or if the data is available, it's in a way that it can't be reported on, or it can't be aggregated, or it can't be used in multi-dimensional states. So maybe there's an Excel spreadsheet that's maintained somewhere. Maybe there's a SharePoint site that's maintained somewhere. There could be a list. Whether it has good integrity or not is always of question. So our clients do come to us, and the reason we get involved with them is because they don't have this data in place, or the data needs to be matured. Right? The processes on how we collect it and how we structure that data needs to be matured. And I think one of the reasons we work so closely with RSA is the Archer product allows you not only to collect the data, but build in sustainable processes to ensure that the data stays accurate moving forward.
Okay, so you're seeing various levels of maturity. It depends on the organization.
We have, absolutely.
Yeah.
The key is if we're missing data, it's not a showstopper for us, right? Every program as they evolve is going to be missing information. The question is, how do we put the right processes in place to collect that data and make that sustainable? But many companies come to us without this information in place. This becomes workshops where we work with them. We bring stakeholders in there to understand the problem. And we go through and we establish a process for collecting and structuring that data.
All right, thank you.
Excellent. So I'm going to do a quick switch over here, and hopefully this.
Yes, there's always a part of the webinar where you hope the VPN is logged in and everything works. So this is a live instance of Archer, correct?
It is a live instance. There is no static data here, so it is a little bit dangerous. Can you see my screen, Glenn?
Yes, looks good.
Excellent. So what I'm going to walk through is, and again, this is Archer. This is the platform that we work with to build these models out. And I want to be able to illustrate how we're collecting this data and what we're doing with this data. But if you're not familiar with Archer, you may get lost, so I may slow down a little bit. It's not intended to be an Archer 101 session, but we want to make sure that you understand the value of the RSA Archer product, why we select it, and why we think this is the best place to collect, structure that data, and organize that data. So I've talked a lot about, actually I'm going to start with vulnerabilities because I want to move on from vulnerabilities. Vulnerabilities can be ingested automatically into Archer. And what you're seeing here is vulnerabilities that have been brought in. And if I pick, if we pick one, I just want to illustrate that the data that's coming in, it's important that we integrate with your scanner of choice, right? So this doesn't remove the need for a scanner. This helps provide better actionable data for your scanner. So the data you're seeing on the screen right now, this allows us to bring in the data. And those familiar with our scanning products, you'll notice this data is straight out of that product. right? So we haven't done anything with the data yet, right? We are given a severity score, we're giving a CVSS score. All of this data comes out of your scanner. What we're doing is we're bringing it into Archer so that we can tie it back to our businesses to be able to aggregate some scores and some risks. Right? So I wanted to start with that because at this point, that's where we stop talking about IT assets and we move over to the business view and work our way back to this data. And I think that's the important part. So it's important, as I mentioned, to collect what is our business hierarchy. What do we look like? What are the different divisions? What are the different business units? How is your company separated? Is it geography? And capture all of that data in here. And I want to illustrate that here. Now, again, this is a live demo environment, so I do have some demo data in here. So I have a company in here called Demo Bank. And we're going to look at Demo Bank here. There's a couple areas here that you'll see that aren't filled out. And the reason for that is Archer has several other use cases that aren't going to be covered in this webinar, and that's where all this other data would go to perform a bunch of other risk metrics and other different programs. So we have our demo bank here, and I know this is a very simplistic view, and for those that don't have a good inventory of products and services or business units, I know this can be a frustrating exercise, and I'm making it sound a little bit simplistic here. We understand it's not. And I think it's important to call that out. I've created a demo bank, and inside that demo bank, I have 4 different divisions. Okay? So I have investment management, I have a human resources department, I have credit management, and I have financial management. Those are the divisions. What I want to call out is as I drill into these divisions now, financial management as an example, I have different business units within financial management. So we have budget, banking, and tax management. And inside of those business units, we actually have products and services, retirement planning, transactional planning, and tax planning. So it's important. I know I went through that really quickly, but I think we could all illustrate the complexity of certain companies can get, a little bit messy. It's important that we understand the relationship because we're going to leverage these relationships as we start building out risk scores. Right? So what I want to do is I want to actually back up to the very first slide where I talked about company and then work our way back. So we have a demo bank, that's our company. We want to illustrate right here, these are the departments or the divisions, within our company. What we've done is we've given it a division risk indicator. And don't think of that as a risk score. And again, all of this is customizable to meet the taxonomy on however you want to call these things out. But this is where we call out what's important to the business or to the company. So financial management, through their risk management process, has determined this is one of the most important parts of the company. It doesn't mean that it's high risk. It just means it is critical. It is an important component of the company. Whereas human resources might be a lower. It's an internal function that is not client-facing, and maybe it has a lower priority to this demo bank. And it's important because it's these risk scores that are going to help us drive the vulnerability risk score, right? So now we understand I have financial management, for example. If I drill into financial management, my business units that I talked about also have their own risk indicator that says how important are these. So even though financial management is important, it's a critical service, it's really only one business unit in here, the banking management system, that is critical. But that does make that a more critical division, and it allows us to break down and figure out inside of those divisions which one is more critical. If we drill into banking management as a business unit now, I want to call out that what we see here is we're able to identify the products and services that are offered under it, so we know this is transactional banking. We're actually able to look at all of the assets that would support this. And this could be a variety of different things. This could be your web server with your database server, with your middleware server, with your application server. There could be a series of things in here, right? It could be the networking gear that supports that the data travels on. But we're able to capture all the assets, the IT assets, that are required to support the transactional banking product that is managed by the banking management business unit. And I want to make sure, I know I'm going through this quickly because there are a bunch of different steps in here, but I think we can all look at your own companies and you could see how this would work in your organization. Although a daunting task, something that needs to be done to be able to arrive at risk scores. So now that we're at our business unit, and I'm looking at our product and service called transactional banking, I can look at the assets that support it. What I want to illustrate to you is at the very end here, we have what's called the device vulnerability risk score. That is an aggregated score from our vulnerability scanners. So to illustrate that, I can drill into one of these assets. I can now see what the asset is. More importantly, I can see all the vulnerabilities that are tied to that asset. Now this happens automatically, right? So as we ingest data from our vulnerability scanner, it uses unique identifiers such as IP addresses or different things depending on your environment to be able to automatically link those vulnerabilities back to an asset and make this relationship work. It takes an aggregate, a calculation, and the calculation can be whatever you want, of all of these scores, all these severity scores, and it derives it at an aggregated score for this device. That device, of course, if I go back, we can see that device is right here, right? It will take all the assets that support that product and service, take all of those scores, and it'll arrive at a business score. Right? So it will take all of this information, it'll take our vulnerability information, it'll take our asset information, and then it's going to take our business indicators, and it's going to use that as a calculation to say, is this critical to me or not? Does that elevate the score or does it lower the score? In this situation, for banking management, it would elevate it because it's a critical asset. If this was HR and it was a low asset, it may actually drive a much lower score here. So our vulnerabilities with the right compensating controls in place on an asset that's not externally facing, on an asset that's not customer facing, that's not important to the company, may drive at a lower score. Okay? And so I wanted to draw that out, that we have now taken vulnerability data through an automatic feed, we've tied it to an asset. Those assets are tied back to products and services to arrive at a risk score that looks just beyond vulnerabilities. It's not just looking at what the vulnerability score is, it's taking into where that asset is, it's taking into what that function does for the company, and how that fits into the overall picture. Now I want to point out one other thing. We have a risk rating score here. We also have a contextual score here. And that's a score that we come up with, and I just wanted to illustrate that we could do this in a bunch of different ways. And what does that mean? What's the difference between a risk rating and a context rating? A context rating could be maybe you have a policy that says, I'm going to remediate all the vulnerabilities in 30 days. Okay? So your risk rating, your business unit vulnerability risk rating has all vulnerabilities that are associated to the asset. The context rating removes everything that's not in violation of a policy, right? So if the vulnerability is 10 days old, that vulnerability won't contribute to that score. Why? Because we assume that IT is fixing it through IT operational means. What this score shows us is that's our score for everything outside of policy. So all vulnerabilities beyond 30 days. Maybe you have a policy that says Java needs to be fixed in 5 days. We can apply a calculation there to take that into account. So I'm looking at all vulnerabilities over 30 days and Java vulnerabilities over 5 days, and we build those into calculations. So now we're building very context-aware risk scores. So in addition to the scores that come out of your vulnerability scanners, we're looking at your business and saying, what is your business doing? And what are the risk elements to it? How do we build that into a calculation to be able to drive at these scores? So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to draw, there's a lot of information in there, so while that sets in, I'm going to go to the end result. Right? On the left side of our screen, these are reports that you would typically see out of a program. They come out of your vulnerability scanning programs as well. Right? We'll see an IP address with all the vulnerabilities attached to it. Right? If we were to click into this, this would drive, here are all the vulnerabilities that need to be fixed on this host. There's a lot. I'm not sure that means anything to us. Or at least it doesn't mean anything on the business side of the house. On the IT side of the house, this might mean something. We also look at things by vulnerability. So here we're looking at the highest offending vulnerability and how many hosts it applies to. Again, this is a great operational activity for somebody to look at this list and understand what to go and patch or what to fix. From the business, this means nothing to them. They don't understand what this means. They don't understand what it applies to. They don't understand, is this in my production environment? Is this in my development environment? Where does this belong to? And do I need to do anything about it? One of the pictures at the bottom here, this is one where we break things down by IT, or by operating system, sorry. What you'll see here is, it's a little bit small, so why don't I make this a little bit bigger just for the point of, so we can see this a little bit better. We've broken things down by operating system. What the operating system tells us is that we have a Windows system that has about 20,000 or 19,000 vulnerabilities. Now I only have about 35,000 vulnerabilities in my demo environment. You could imagine in an environment where you have hundreds of thousands or potentially millions of vulnerabilities outstanding, these graphs become very difficult to consume. They become overwhelming. So what we're suggesting is if we take a business approach, we're now looking at the right-hand side of the screen. All right? So we're looking at the top one is the first metric I showed, where we took an aggregation of vulnerabilities, we aggregated that with a business risk score, and we arrived at a business unit or a division risk score. So this is by division. So we had financial management as a division that supported a bunch of products and services. We're sitting around 6. Right? And we know that it's not good, but it's not bad either, right? It's probably right around within our risk threshold. We haven't taken away the context aware things yet, the things that are in or out of policy. And we can also look at this at a more granular level down to the business view, right? Because we have this data, and we've tied vulnerabilities to the asset, to the business unit, to the division, and to the company, we have the ability to look at where we sit and aggregate that data and make better informed decisions. I go back to the to the division view. We'll see here that we know that human resources may be higher on our chart, but it's a lower risk to the business. Right? We know that financial management was a critical asset. I know that because I built the environment, but a company would know that this is a critical one if we drill down into it, and that would show us that our vulnerabilities are the lowest on our most critical infrastructure. That's a good thing. It's important to call out that these reports are also we can drill down into them. So through financial management, we can break right down into our business units that drive those numbers. Here are the numbers. Again, there's the assets with our information, and we have direct access to all the vulnerabilities associated with it. As vulnerabilities are remediated and repaired, that dashboard will adjust and the score will fluctuate. Now the dashboard below it shows us the same data, except it's the context aware. So these are the things that are in or out of policy. And you can see how we're arriving at a much different score than if we don't have the context aware, right? So we're taking a bunch of different data, we're aggregating it to come at the right score. And what I think this illustrates for us is the ability to be flexible and adapt to every company to understand what's your risk posture, what's your risk score, what are the goals for your business, and what do you want to achieve to be able to drive the results to drive a better program. We know that looking down here, they have to fix these, right? These are out of policy. If you want to prioritize on something, you should probably prioritize on these ones. These ones are out of policy, and for lack of a better argument, IT has probably missed them or hasn't gotten around to them in the time they're supposed to get to them, right? Now a business owner knows that. Whoever's in charge of credit management understands that there's something in his environment. Maybe he doesn't like the risk rating. Maybe this puts him out of compliance with a different regulatory body somewhere else. But this helps us drive different views on different data, right? So at a very quick demo, I think we were able to illustrate how the different business hierarchy ties together and how we can actually reach out and grab the vulnerability data and use it to come up with business scores, as opposed to having vulnerabilities try and collect it the other way. Now, Glenn, I'm going to switch back out of the demo, but before I do that, I just want to ask if there was any questions that came through around what I showed in the demo.
Yeah, we've had a number of questions coming in, a couple that are
Awesome.
more towards the data that you're using to build this. So I'll ask you both of them. They're a little bit related. One was around just the source data that you're using for this demo. Is it using a Hadoop backend or a direct to Archer, going direct to Archer via data feed? And the other question was, you maybe touched on a little bit, but you know, often organizations are dealing with millions of points of data around vulnerability. So would clients be bringing in the raw scan results into Archer, or you know, how would that be coming in, and how do you deal with performance issues around that?
Absolutely, two very good questions. The first one, if I understood the question, is where's my data coming from? I'll be honest, the vulnerability data inside this platform is taken from two different sources. It's taken from Rapid7 and from Qualys. Those are the two platforms that I've integrated with to pull this data in, and it reaches out through an API to both those platforms through a data feed. So hopefully that answers that question.
Okay.
It's an automatic data feed that requires no human intervention.
Okay.
So hopefully that answers that one. If not, whoever asked that question, please ask for more. But that's where the source data comes from, and that's an important component. To be a sustainable program, we need to be able to have an automated way of pulling in these vast amounts of data. Now, to the second question around how do we bring in all this type of data? It's a very good question, and it really drives into, I have two graphs shown on the report on the screen right now. One is a risk score that just says I'm going to take all the vulnerabilities and I'm going to apply it against my business risk elements and arrive at a score. The second one, and one on the bottom, says I'm going to take context aware. I'm going to take things out of policy. I'm going to take things that I want to focus on. To be able to do that, you have to understand what you want to focus on. I want to focus on vulnerabilities that are over a year old, over 3 years old, over so old. It's a good question that says, listen, if I have 3 million vulnerabilities, why bring them in? I can't fix them, right? I don't believe in bringing in data for the sake of bringing in data, right? We're bringing in data to turn, to be able to drive actionable results, better decision-making and better results. So I would say the same way that I've just put a formula in place here to calculate a context-aware score, the same thing has to be done. And we work with clients all the time in workshops to say, what data do you want to bring in? Don't bring in 3 million records. Understand what you want to bring in. Hey, listen, we have 3 million records. Great, let's look at the raw reports. How many are over 2 years old, probably? Hey, why don't we start there, right? Why don't we start bringing awareness to things that are out of policy? And that's a very simplistic answer, but you know, let's look at things that are manageable. Let's look at things that we can actually fix. To bring data in here and put it on a chart and have that chart just represent millions or hundreds of thousands is not going to be very effective in prioritizing and making better decisions. So as much as we've illustrated these charts on this dashboard, I would also say there has to be a maturity program put in place to say, what data do I want to bring in? And we talk about this at Iceberg in the way of current mode of operations and future mode of operations, where we say, hey, future mode operation 1, FMO1, we're going to bring in this set of data. We're going to build a program around it, and we're going to get better at this. Future FMO2, we're going to go after the next set of data. FMO3 is the next set of data. To be able to say we're going to bring data in here, and it's just going to magically drive remediation, and in a month everything's going to be fixed, that's not true, right? There's processes, there's culture change, there's things that have to happen for this program to work. Bringing in manageable, bite-sized data, I think, is really important. So we work and we have workshops that we work with clients to understand what that data is and how best to approach that. We look at the raw data and we say, what do we want to bring in, what do we want to bring in, and how do we mature it? Maybe that's a 6-month process. Maybe that's a 3-year process. Depends on how bad the situation is. Hopefully that answers the question.
One more question, if you want to jump to the other slide while you're answering. A question is, how is business risk assigned to assets that are traditionally IT only, like firewalls, switches, and so on?
That's a great question. So I would say I treat, so in my previous life, I was in the financial sector. I would treat things like the network backbone, email, the different collaboration that IT supports and offers back to the business. I would treat those as a business unit, right? Email is a product and service you're offering back to your business. Very similar to the way we have HR listed in here. HR is not a client-facing application. HR is an internal-only service to the rest of its clients are the internal members of the organization. I would look at IT infrastructure the same, right? Okay. So email is a platform that we offer to the bank for communication. How important is it to your company that email stays up and running? Well, somebody would have to arrive at a business score. It's still within IT. I get that we're crossing layers here, but it's still within IT saying how important it is it to all your business units that email's alive? How important is it that the network's there? How important is it that we have a gateway? How important is it that we have these other factors? And we look at IT assets, look at them as business units. That's my suggestion.
Okay. Well, I've got a few more, but I'll let you keep going, and we'll come back to some more questions in a moment.
Excellent. So I only have a couple more slides here, and let me see if I can jump right back into this.
There we go. Yeah.
What I wanted to show is the platform that I've just illustrated this in. This is, again, I've mentioned it before, this is RSA Archer. This is everything that you saw was done through the risk management use case. So there are, if you're familiar with the RSA Archer product, there are many different use cases that do many different things. What we've demonstrated today was solely done through the use of one application. We were able to take data in, we were able to provide some business context to it, we were able to do a bunch of fun algorithms to drive at different results, all through one application. The next one I want to talk about is Iceberg ourselves, right? So a lot of the questions that I just heard were around how do you do this, right? How do companies approach this when I have too much data? How do we start off? You know, how do we look at data and how do we arrive at the right scores? How do I classify my business functions like email or IT functions? How do I bring those into the equation, because sometimes they take up half of our IT assets? And I think those are all good questions, and I think that's where Iceberg comes in to play, right? The RSA Archer is a great product. We believe that it provides an amazing backbone for a GRC product, for a GRC program. But the important piece for us is how do you take what you're doing in your business today and how do you bring that into the platform? Right? How do I take what's, I don't want to call broken, but how would I take what's not working, or how do I take what's in siloed, broken up pieces of data, how do I bring that in and bring that into a sustainable process? And I think that's where Iceberg comes in. Right, so we have workshops where we'll sit down and we'll talk to you about where are you today and where do you want to go, right? How much data do you have, and is this the right fit for you? Is there some cleanup you have to do before you even get into the tool? Or how do we use it to be most effective? So I think we help build strategies on how you want to build your vulnerability management program into a bunch of other services we offer, but today's session's around vulnerability management. Our takeaway, or what we strive for, is we try and build a GRC program that drives better decision-making from the leadership teams. The messaging that we're hearing from all of our clients in the industry is that has to start with a business-centric view. Right? If we bring these very critical vulnerability type of pieces of information back to the business and let the business drive it, we have a much better success rate at getting it done. And that's our goal. Our goal is to bring this data back to trusted, aggregated, and transparent risk data. So a couple David, quick, yeah, go ahead.
I was going to ask, diving in there, so you did mention in your previous life that you led a project at a bank. So you've been through this from the front lines, and it is process change. It is a rethinking of how you're doing vulnerability management. So I'm just curious about what kind of pushback you might have had, either from the IT side or the business side, and how did you overcome that?
Yeah, good question. I did. I led a strategic initiative to take this on. I'm trying to think how to say this. Nobody necessarily wants to have vulnerabilities attached to them, right? And as an IT problem, what I hear is we don't have resourcing. We have too many business initiatives. We have too many things happening. So we built a program around bringing this back to the business. And what the business, it was very interesting. The business looked at this and said, well, I didn't know. I wasn't aware. And they became very interested. They became very interested for a couple of reasons. One, they don't want to run into compliance issues. Another, a very, very, very big reason was, as we started building out these dashboards, nobody wanted their department or their business unit losing. It became a competition within the organization. I don't know if that's healthy or not, but that's exactly what happened, was the business became very invested in making that go away. So they said, hey, listen, I have 10 initiatives with IT right now. I'm going to knock off the bottom 2 initiatives, and I'm going to give them those cycles to go and fix those problems for me. So instead of becoming an IT problem where we go, well, how do I patch? How do I do regression testing? The operational headaches that come along with patch management and production testing, it became a business go fix it discussion. I'm not sure that was culturally acceptable because it became a very factual, it's broken, go fix it discussion. But what it did was it drove an 80% reduction of vulnerabilities in a very short amount of time. And that was purely because we made people aware of vulnerabilities that affected their product. And they didn't want to assume that risk. So we found that by bringing that data back to the business, it drove better results. But to your point, there was a culture change. There's change management. There was process reengineering. Right? There was a long effort to get the data right. Right? So we didn't have the data. We didn't have our products and services. We didn't have our business units well defined. We had to build that out. It was a lengthy exercise, but it's one you have to start with. Right? It's one that you have to dig in and you have to get it right. Once you get it right and you build the right sustainable process, the program takes off from there.
Right. Once the results start coming in, it's easy to build momentum, get people on board.
Absolutely. So Glenn, you talked about all these things like culture change and process reengineering. Again, that's where Iceberg comes in. We do workshops to sit down with companies to bring in stakeholders to get them to buy into that process. They need to understand why this is of value to them. They need to understand why this is a good thing. This isn't just more bad data. This is data that helps them get to a better place. And through our workshops, we find that they're very receptive and it helps drive better results.
So, David, a couple questions. We do have some time, so I'm hoping to get a couple more questions in from our audience. Here's one. Isn't this method making a broad assumption that IT assets that are in a low-risk business segment would be very isolated from assets in a higher-risk business segment?
No, that's a fair point. What I would say is we don't want to ever say that a vulnerability should be ignored. That is not the intent. The intent here is not to say a vulnerability that can be exploited that belongs to a business unit, just because that business unit is not very important to the company, we should forget about it. Okay. Not by any means, right? We believe in fixing vulnerabilities to protect organizations. What I would say is when we have millions of vulnerabilities or hundreds of thousands of vulnerabilities, it becomes a factor in where do we start. We got to start with our more critical assets. We got to start what's important to the business and work our way back. So it becomes an avenue for prioritizing how we approach vulnerability management to drive better results. In no way do we forget about it, but the same vulnerability on a critical asset is probably a higher priority to remediate than the one on the lower business unit. Still needs to be fixed, but maybe just at a different priority.
Okay, and another question, going back to, you're talking about using Archer for I guess for asset management, do you have to use Archer for the asset management piece, or can you use a different tool and have some kind of federation between Archer and another tool?
No, great question. We would actually recommend that you do have, now I want to be clear, the terminology between asset management and a common CMDB.
Okay.
Archer, we've never really positioned and that Archer should be a CMDB. It's a great source for taking business type of asset data, but we do believe your CMDB or your asset management tool should be a different platform where we pull that data in. So very similar to how I talked about, I reached out to do 2 different platforms to pull in vulnerability data. We recommend having a formal, proper CMDB and integrating from that. So using that as your trusted source of data, we bring that into Archer, and we use that data to aggregate and come up with scores.
Okay, great.
So Glenn, that's all the slides on the material I had. We're approaching the end of the hour here.
We are. Well, maybe a last question, David. People who watch this and say, yes, this is, we need to change how we're doing vulnerability management. We need to get going on this. What's the very first step? What's something they could do after this webinar to get started? What could they do? Can you give a little bit of a roadmap of how you move forward?
Yeah, absolutely. Now, naturally, I think I have to say, give us a call, we'll help you. But before you give us a call and help us, there's obviously things you can do to help yourself. Understanding and trying to get a good handle on what the relationship is between the company and your products and services. That can be a messy plate of spaghetti at times, right? But there's no reason why you can't start collecting and formulating that data while you build a program out. Because that's data that eventually we're going to have to collect, or we're going to have to organize at some point. So understanding what products and services you have, how they're related, and tying those assets back to that product and services is huge. I know a lot of companies, we have our BIAs and our DR plans that have a lot of this information, but every time we go and use that information, we find that the information is very subjective. It has to be revisited, it has to be cleaned up, the integrity of that data has to be redone. So you can definitely help yourself just by collecting that organizational data to put yourself in a better place.
All right, well, we are at the end of our time. David, thanks again for the discussion today. Want to remind people that a copy of the presentation deck is available on our website, icebergnetworks.com/vulnerability. We'll get the video up there later this afternoon that you can share with your colleagues if you'd like. David is available at dwight@icebergnetworks.com, or you can use our general address there on the screen, info@icebergnetworks.com. And with that, thanks, David, and thanks to everyone for tuning in today to our webinar.
Great. Thank you, everyone, for your time.
Have a great afternoon.